Thanks for tuning in to U2 Concast. What you are about to watch is one of the videos in our special series on Irish poet Brendan Kennelly. Kennelly has a long history of connections to U2. His epic poem, The Book of Judas, was released in 1991, the same year as Achtung Baby, which has its own Judas-inspired song. The poet and Bono reviewed each other's works in the Irish newspaper, The Sunday Press. Later, Kennelly reviewed the pop album for the U2 fan magazine Propaganda. Most recently, you may have seen the poet mentioned in the liner notes for Songs of Experience, where Bono said Kennelly challenged him to, quote, write as if you're dead. And Bono contributed a reading of one of the Book of Judas poems to the video launch of the Brendan Kennelly Literary Archive in April of 2021. All of our concasts about Brendan Kennelly, as well as links to more resources and to his books, can be found on our U2 Studies page at u2conference.com. Welcome to the U2 Concast. Today, we are talking with Dr. Mary McAuliffe about Brendan Kennelly, a poet who has had impact on U2 in a number of ways over the years. U2 Concasts are for enhancing our understanding and enjoyment of U2 and the fan experience. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below or by reaching out to us at u2conference.com. You can also like and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our conversations. Thanks for tuning in. Dr. McAuliffe, really a real pleasure to have you today.
Well, glad to be here.
So tell me about your family background. I understand you are the niece of Brendan Kennelly. So tell me about, is it your mother or father who's a sibling of Brendan's? Did you grow up in County Kerry as he did? And is it a large family?
My own family, yes. My mother is Brendan's sister. And I did grow up in County Kerry as well, but although not in Ballylongford, where the Kennelly family grew up, in a village about 12 miles away from Ballylongford to all. The town of Listowel is in between the two, and of course Brendan's great friend John B. Keane lived in Listowel, so the whole North Kerry area has a long and storied history of literary and poetic imagination and writers, including Brendan's paternal relation, Bob Boland, who that's probably where the poetic imagination comes from, through that line, the paternal line. The Bolands of Farnastack were my grandfather, Timmy Kennelly's family, and among that, his first cousin, Bob, was a local poet and writer. And Brendan talks about Bob Boland's impact, both as a person, but also, you know, that poetic imagination being passed down through the generations.
So what kind of age difference is there? Not to get too specific, but did you grow up knowing about your uncle? Were you spending a lot of time with him, or how did that? Because at a certain point, he was away to Trinity, right, and doing much work there.
Absolutely. He's actually my godfather, and believe it or not, my second name is Brendan. Aww. Mary Brendan, because he insisted, since nobody was called after him, that despite the fact that I was a girl, I would have his name. I was very close to him growing up. He's very good with kids, with children, and we got on really well together. And when I went to secondary school, I was in boarding school. He used to write to me and send me, you know, books and other things that would help me in English, although I myself am not a literary scholar. I didn't go that route. I'm actually a historian. But in many ways, it's very similar, because North Kerry has a huge history, a history reaching back, you know, thousands of years, but very much so from the medieval. And near Ballylongford is an amazing castle or tower house called Carrigafoyle. And the stories of the O'Connors of Carrigafoyle, and Brendan has a book that he wrote about the attack by the Elizabethans on Carrigafoyle Castle, one of his early publications. So that influenced him, and it influenced me as well to grow up in that area. I went the history route, he went the literary and poetic route. But I think we were both very much influenced by the background and the landscape and the histories among which we grew up. But yes, my Uncle Brendan was, I'm sorry to all my other uncles, but he was my favorite uncle, yes, growing up.
But it is a lot of uncles out there too, huh?
There are, yeah. There are 6 boys and 2 girls in the Kennelly family. So yes, they were all very, very nice, obviously. But also myself and my sister grew up very close to Brendan, and both of us ended up going to Trinity. Actually, she read English in Trinity and I read history. So for me, you know, the fact that Brendan was in Trinity, in my imagining, there was nowhere else to go. I was always going to Trinity, and I look back on my diaries, and as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, because I'd read the diary of Anne Frank, so I started keeping a diary, which is really cool to look back on now. I am talking about going to Trinity at that age. So I think I didn't realize there were other universities for quite a while. But yeah, I ended up there. And of course, then I knew him in college, and we used to go for coffees and things like that.
Well, now that you're speaking of Trinity and speaking of the Elizabethan attack in Kerry, my memory, so I got to meet your uncle once, and was in Trinity with him, going up the stairs to whatever his study, tea room, whatever it would have been. But as we were going up the stairs, he pointed to the portrait of Queen Elizabeth on the wall and said, our founder. But it's a complicated relationship with Elizabeth. It's
a complicated relationship with Elizabeth and Trinity, but also with North Kerry, because during the rebellion of well, I won't go into the whole history of it because it's very complicated, but in the late 16th century, the lands of the O'Connors of Carrigafoyle, who would have been the Gaelic family that we all learned about growing up and who built that fantastic tower house at Carrigafoyle, their lands were forfeit and given by Elizabeth to the Fellows of Trinity College. So there's a long, long connection between North Kerry and Trinity College, and part of that long connection is a Reed Sizarship that was put in place where students from Kerry could apply for this Reed Sizarship, and those who got best in the exam got the Reed Sizarship, and Brendan got it, and both my uncles got it, and I got it. So the connection between Trinity, Elizabeth, North Kerry is quite complicated, but it's there. And of course, then going to Trinity, part of the Reed Sizarship was to get commons every evening, and where thanks was given to our foundress, Queen Elizabeth.
Interesting. Wow.
So that was all very interesting. And I used to see Brendan at the high table while the rest of us were down at dining every evening. So all those interconnections have been there all throughout my life between Brendan, Trinity, history, poetry, everything.
Trinity now actually has the literary archive of Brendan's. Can you talk a little about how that archive came about and the role you took? I saw there was a video that was introducing the archive to the world, and you took part in that on behalf of the family. So tell me a little about that.
Yes, well, Brendan decided to give his archive to the library at Trinity College quite a number of years ago, well before he left Dublin and was, retired back down to Kerry. And so part of it went into the library then. But then when he retired, he was unable to finish cataloguing and pulling the library together. So a number of us set up the Brendan Kennelly Literary Trust for that, and for other reasons as well, to preserve and promote his literary legacy. And so when he went to Kerry, the Provost and the Fellows of Trinity gave myself and my sister time to go through his rooms, to pull the archive together. He never threw anything out, never. Not a note, not a scribbling, not a letter he got. So we found so many different drafts of poems and scribblings he did on flight records going onto airplanes, or pieces of paper or napkins. he got in coffee shops or on pieces of paper, obviously, and different drafts of different poems going right back to when he was a teenager. So they were still there. And so the archive is going to show the progress and development and poetic imagination as it developed through the decades of a really well-known poet and a really accomplished poet and literary scholar, but also the public person, the Brendan who was on radio, who was commenting on TV, who was talking about education and literature more broadly, and other things. I was very surprised actually at one stage because in 2018, obviously in Ireland, we were going through the campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which outlawed abortion in Ireland. And coincidentally, I found I think it was a Hot Press article or an In Dublin article, I can't recall which, from 1983, in which Brendan opposed the putting in of the Eighth Amendment into the Constitution. So he had political ideas, he had poetic imagination. His devotion and dedication to teaching and to his students really shines through, and so many of them kept in touch afterwards and wrote to him. Also saw some letters from or correspondence with U2 and with other musicians and scholars. He loved music, and there's a whole section that we put into the archive that are the tapes he was listening to and the music he was listening to, and people talking to him about music, because he grew up, his parents owned a pub, and if you know Irish pubs, singing, reciting, conversation, that's all part of it, and that's really part of his background, as well as my own parents owned a pub as well. So you hear the songs, you hear the poems that people are reciting, and that goes into your, whether you think about it consciously or subconsciously, goes into your imagination and your writings as well.
So let's expand a little bit on that, because that is something I have understood is the correspondence that he has had with quite a cross section of people. Not just if you're a professor and a beloved professor, you'll hear a lot from your students, and it sounds like there's a good deal of correspondence with people he has taught over the years. But also, as you said, there's conversations with you too. The president of Ireland showed up on the Literary Archive video. That there's so many people he's been in conversation with throughout the years. What do you think draws people to him?
I think because he responds. I mean, you have to remember this was the days before email, and we were all, bowed down under the amount of email you get. He actually replied to everybody. You can see that when people wrote to him, he responded. When people stopped him in the street, he responded. He had time to give to people. And I think that's maybe why he got up so early in the morning, so he could have time for himself and for his writing. Because once the day started and he was out wandering or having a coffee, you could see people stopped and talked to him all the time. He was so well known. And he had that empathy to give to people, to respond to their concerns, to chat to them, to joke with them, that fellow feeling was always there with him. And I think, he was also a bit of an introvert, but he was an introvert who could give. It doesn't mean you don't correspond with people. It means he also needed time for himself and his privacy and his space to write. And he took that, but he also had that time to give to people, and people recognize that. So you see correspondence from not just Ireland, but all over the world, everywhere. People sending him their work, people asking for help, people asking for wisdom, if he could give it. People asking, telling him he was almost like a confessional in some ways for some people. And I think he took that seriously. He responded to people. If they took the time to write to him, he would write back to them. One
aspect of this all that I want to pull back a little, because I'm calling to you from America, and we have people who tune into the U2 Concast from all over, but I can speak from the American perspective. It is unusual to see a poet have such a prominent place in culture to an American audience. Although, things are looking up with Amanda Gorman making a splash at the recent inauguration. But poets, it just seems to me at least, is a very prominent role in Irish culture and history. Again, to the point, President of Ireland is a poet himself. Do you have, as a historian, an opinion on the prominence of poetry in Irish society and how that came about?
Well, again, I'm not a literary historian either, so in my opinion, and I suppose just general opinion, rather than an absolutely expert opinion, is that for a long time, Irish society, particularly the society outside of the upper class, was very much an oral society, transmission through storytelling and poetry, that way of communicating. So poetry was very much part of people's ordinary everyday experience. And so we've always had that engagement with the poets, even our rebels. And this is from I'm actually a historian of women, of gender, particularly revolutionary women at the moment. But if you look at our revolutionaries, say in the 1916 Rising, quite a number of them were poets and playwrights and writers. And so we always seem to have that connection with culture as being a very obvious and evident and living part of our society. And so poets, particularly poets who are very vocal and communicative, I suppose, like Brendan was, and he would go on the Late Late Show, are known far and wide. But I mean, Seamus Heaney is also an example, or Paul Muldoon, or I could name many, many poets myself. I'm now trying to think of a woman poet. Paula Meehan, yes. Katie Donovan are all well known to, one of my favorites, Rita Ann Higgins, who Brendan really loved, talks to people's imagination, talks to people's realities, talks to people's concerns, and whether it be love or hate or death or whatever, or politics. I think we have that connection with our literary scholars, and I hope it's something we never lose. But I think in America you have that too. I mean, you've Audre Lorde and many of the American poets that, for me as a feminist, I read them because they're amazing. They speak words that are truths in many ways of class and race and sexuality. And so poetry is something, I think that if you allow it, it can really speak to your soul and to your imagination.
And there's so much of a connection between, as we talked a little earlier about poetry and music. Clearly, Brendan had that connection for himself and through his upbringing. And I'm fascinated by the way one impacts the other. So, my introduction to your uncle was through you two, through hearing them talk about him and his Book of Judas around the time that Achtung Baby came out, that line, the best way to serve the age is to betray it, which Bono seems to always misquote, but I think that's the right way of saying it. It clearly was a touchstone for them in that work. And then even in the most recent, the Songs of Innocence and Experience, Songs of Experience, Bono writes about Brendan saying, write as if you're dead, and using that as like a launch pad for that work, which has had such an impact on countless people around the world. So in your historical opinion, seeing your uncle, do you have a sense of how he has impacted Irish history? What long time, now that he is somebody who has had so many conversations, so many appearances on the Late Late Show, all of the ways that he has been a part of the popular consciousness, what do you think that's going to go into?
I think it's kind of difficult for me as being his niece to separate myself out from knowing him as my uncle and thinking he's fantastic anyway. And he's one of his early poems, My Dark Fathers, is one of my favorite poems because it talks about the past and the impact the, I suppose, colonial experience and the experience of trauma and famine had on Irish people, that we were so shamed that the singer would turn his face to the wall in order to sing a song. And also and I can't remember the exact quote, but at the end of one of his novels, he did write two. He talks about, you know, the history of small places, like the Crooked Cross, which is Ballylongford. If those are lost, then we lose all sense of who and what we are. So that we have to remember our histories, both at national and local level. For me, that's very, very important. We have to remember all our histories, including women's history, which has been my lifelong, I suppose, work, and will continue to be on into the future. But I think for Brendan, you know, when the lockdown began last year, it seems like an eon ago now, but in March 2020, and we all had to pivot to online teaching and Zooms, a lot of people began to share his poem Begin, because it resonated with something in people's psyche, because of certain people of a certain generation would remember when he said it on the Late Late, when a woman phoned in, or Gay Byrne phoned a woman and said she'd won something, and she said, well, my daughter has just died in the last few days. And Gay, I mean, it was an extraordinary moment. Gay didn't know what to say, but Brendan did. And he commiserated with her, and then he said the poem Begin. And I think people find in his poetry something that helps them, something that resonates with their lives, whether they're in lockdown or whether it's about love or death or feeling or history, or all of those emotions. And I think more and more, as his legacy, as his poetic legacy, and the archive will help this, is being looked at, I think it will be realized he was one of the great poets. And maybe I'm being a bit biased here now because he is my uncle, but I think he is one of the greats that was produced by Ireland in the 20th century. And I think that will be there. That is his legacy, and that will continue long after we're all gone.
Well, I am of that opinion too. So with the two of us, maybe we'll write the history of this time, and we can cement that legacy. Dr. McAuliffe, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. I really appreciate the time. And to all of you out there, thanks for watching. Check us out at u2conference.com. We have links to our website and our Discord server in the video description.
Zooming in, zooming out.